Hello, Wendy Bacon. Thanks for your time. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for talking to all you can meet. Wendy, it's never good to use Wikipedia as a source when you are researching, but to get a first overview of a topic, it's quite handy actually. So obviously I tried to look you up as well, but I couldn't find anything. Why is that?
To tell you the truth, I've never looked to see whether I'm on Wikipedia. I know I'm on the web because people sometimes actually, once someone got a whole lot of things about my past quite wrong, and I discovered that was at Monash University, even though I never went to Monash University. So maybe people start Wikipedia entries on themselves, but I don't know. No, I'm not worried that I'm not on Wikipedia, but yeah, I've never checked.
Okay. You were born in Melbourne and you grew up as one of 5 children, as I found out. Tell us more about your childhood, please.
So I was born in Melbourne, in what was then the outer suburbs of Melbourne in Reservoir. My father was a general practitioner there after the Second World War, and I lived there till I was about 12. It was a new suburb. I had 4 siblings. We eventually moved to another part of Melbourne. I went to Melbourne University, and when I was 19, at Melbourne University I did history. That was my background, and then when I was nearly 20, I moved to Sydney. My plan was that it would be a stepping stone to going and living in London, but I got so caught up in Sydney and made many friends here in an organisation, or it wasn't an organisation, it was a group called the Sydney Push, that I never really moved on, and it was not till later that I went overseas.
Okay. One of the main reasons why I'm interviewing you is because you live in Newtown and the blog is about people who live in Newtown. Why did you decide to move to Newtown?
The reason I decided to move to Newtown is that my partner Chris Nash, who used to work at UTS with me but is now the Professor of Journalism at Monash, he already lived there. Now my base had always been, from when I was about 24 more, up around King's Cross. At the time when I moved to Newtown, I was actually in a little flat in Elizabeth Bay, and I'd squatted in Victoria Street in King's Cross back in the 70s, twice in the 70s. So when I met Chris, he already had a timber cottage, a very old timber cottage in Gowrie Street in Newtown. This was before it became more gentrified. And so that was in 86. So when I moved in with him, I moved to Newtown.
If you would have to describe Newtown in a few words, what would you say?
I think Newtown is very mixed. It's very community. I know quite a lot of people in our street, not as many maybe as I used to. I think when I had children who were going to the local school, inevitably you get caught up in more networks, childcare centres, that sort of thing. But yeah, Newtown's still a good place to be. I like the fact that, I don't like the fact that there are people having to live on the streets. I don't like that. But I like the fact that I'm in a suburb where that's not hidden away.
How would you describe the people who live in Newtown?
I really don't think there is one type of person in Newtown. Like, let's say there's a lot of people like me, I guess you could say a professional person with a political past, there's probably loads of us, and then there's a lot of gay people, and then there's also a lot of people with really young children now, I noticed, and in fact, they were nearly going to close down one of the local schools about 8 or 9 years ago, and it survived. It went from very low numbers, it's now booming, so it's back being a sort of children, families. I think there's also some very poor people in Newtown, people living on the streets, so they're all part of it. And then students, but sadly I think it's hard for students to afford to live in Newtown now. I think they're more having to move to Marrickville and even out beyond that. I mean, it's great to live near when you're young, it's great to live, I think, near the centre of a city.
Back in those days when you came to Sydney, you didn't maybe really know what life will be for you. Now you're one of the most famous investigative journalists in Australia. Did you plan a career like this?
Oh, I certainly didn't plan any career, and I don't know that I'm one of the most famous investigative journalists, but I certainly have had a career as a journalist, and I have taught hundreds and hundreds of students now. So did I plan it? No. I think one of the things back in the 1970s when I really developed, I was then sort of in my very early 20s, I think that we didn't really plan careers. It's interesting, I did a lot of journalism Then for alternative publications, we did a squatters newspaper, and it was far less career focused. But of course, we could live. I mean, I had a postgraduate scholarship then too, and so I've got to acknowledge that and say I lived to some extent off the state. But I didn't really go into full-time employment as a journalist till I was 30. So I certainly didn't plan. In a way, I've always taken life's taken some turns for me, where at one stage I was planning to be a lawyer, but then that didn't work out. I wasn't, approved to be a lawyer because of various political things that I've been involved with to do with squatting and prisons and other things. So I wouldn't say I'm not a good case of a person who's planned. When I came to UTS in the 90s, I didn't think I'd be here this long. And in a way, it's the teaching and the students that's really, got me so involved here. But I certainly didn't plan it that way.
You teaching investigative journalism, especially here at UTS. What's the hardest part, you'd say, about investigative journalism?
One of the hardest parts, I think, particularly when you're setting out, two things I would say about that. One, it's so frustrating in Australia the way that people who are accountable to people should be answering questions stonewall and refuse to answer questions. And say, for example, we've had students come from Denmark to here. They find that quite surprising. It's a feature of our culture. I think we inherited more from the British secrecy kind of approach. So that's very frustrating, because sometimes, people are feeling they've got to get the other side of the story, but they can't. The other thing is, I think the hard thing to learn is everything is strategy. That you've got to kind of think at every point, how's this game going to be played? What move do I make? If I make that move, what move does these other people make? And once people get the hang of that, it's a lot of fun. I think the other really tough thing is to fit it into the available time, because investigative journalism does take a lot of time, and that can be a bit frustrating too. But generally, I hope that students come out of the course with the feeling that at least they know how to find out information.
But before it comes to finding information, it comes to finding stories. Where do you get your stories from?
Well, usually we do a mixture. I mean, sometimes at the moment we're doing a project on, which actually the Australian Centre for Independent Journalism is doing with Crikey, and that is about the relationship of public relations to journalism. So that is sort of a set project. And then where do we get the stories from? Well, sometimes, what I always say to students is you've just got to talk to people. And you've just got to say, is there anything you know about that you think is important that hasn't been out there? You've got to talk to all your contacts. And then if you're not someone who's out there in the world talking to people, and you're just going home every night to your little suburban house, having dinner with your parents, well, your parents might be full of stories. That's a chance, I agree. But generally speaking, you've got to go out there and mix it in the world, and stories will come to you. Once, of course, you get your first one or two big stories, well, then people come to you with stories. So it's always hard when you're setting out as a student.
Well, what's your advice from your experience? How do you get people to talk to you, actually, especially in Australia?
That's an interesting question. And again, I think, first of all, you've got to approach people. You can't approach them in a sort of hostile way. And this is where, some people can think journalism is all perhaps slightly duplicitous or slightly dishonest, because what I always say to students is you're not going to get anywhere unless you really try to get the person on side. So, for example, you might be trying to interview a property developer who's got some property development you want to question them about. I always say try and get face-to-face with the person. It's much easier to get a person on side if you're face-to-face with them. Although sometimes you just got to pop the question on the phone. But try to get in the same room as them, and then, you can, it's not unethical to say, tell me all the great things about your development, tell me all the great things you've done. And sometimes it's interesting that people let slip, and then you can just slide in a small question saying, what did you mean by that, what happened then? So there's a lot of tactics. I'm not the world's best interviewer by a long way, but we try to bring in some people who can also talk about that. And so interviewing is tough, and getting people to speak is tough. It's something you need lifelong experience in.
If you'd have the chance to start your career again, what would you change?
That's a really hard one. What would I change? I think because of the things that happened to me with the law, and even when I was younger, I went to prison briefly over obscenity things. I think I've always taken the approach that I don't look back. I mean, I'm not someone who's going to sit here and think, I could have done that or I could have done that. I think you very much have to accept the life you lead. You know, you have to make your decisions and then you've got to live with them. I don't think you can go back and say, well, I could have been, you know, a judge, or I could have been this, because actually it's meaningless.